Afternoon. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. And we hope we have we think we have lots of great information to share with you today. So we'll wait a few minutes and make sure we get everybody in. Okay, so we're going to go through and get started here in a minute. And if you could leave your audio and your video off, that really helps us with bandwidth. And then we don't have as many issues as we're going through. So it's better for you. And this Zoom talk is being recorded. I just thought I'd let you know. There is a chat box. We'd love for you to put items in the chat box, including things that you would like to hear about, in future Veggie happenings. If you would not like your name to be visible, feel free to go up to your picture or where your picture would be if your video were on. There's 3 little dots, and if you click on there, you can go through and rename yourself. So if you would rather not have your name up. So we are being recorded. You can go up and do speaker view. Right now, you probably will only see myself and Kathy McVan, and we are your 2 speakers this time. And so today we're going to talk about really giving back. This is the time of year when everybody's thankful, and we are really thankful for our soil. Our soil gives us so much through the year. We take so much from it, and we try to constantly give back to our soil. But this time of year is where we really want to add that added punch in it. We are master gardeners, so we do practice sustainable gardening. We always try to nurture and protect the soil because it is our life force here. We try to plant the right plant in the right place at the right time. Everything does so much better, and you need much less interventions. You don't have as many problems. We mulch to save water and to prevent weeds. We don't use synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. We practice minimal soil disturbance, which means not tilling up the ground. We also plant flowers that benefit plants and insects. And we use compost and organic amendments. So these photos are from a video that was shot at my house, and I had started out going through and looking at my beds, and you're always planting. I have lots of space to plant, which is wonderful, but I do have hard pan clay soil, and I have raised beds. So this bed that I'm kneeling by this time is full of strawberries, and I had them for, I think this was the 4th year that they were in. It's always good to write these things down as well. And boy, I got some strawberries. They were ever-bearing strawberries, so I got a few, throughout the year. But I had planted another bed of strawberries, and this one just wasn't doing as well. So usually after 3 years or so, you replant new strawberries. They're just not as productive. When I started in this bed, I went down and I thought, I'm going to take out all the strawberries, and I know there's going to be tree roots in there because I had such problem with that before. And I thought, that's my problem. I knew for sure. Well, that wasn't my problem. And so you have to be flexible. I think you need to always be looking ahead and trying to figure out, what am I going to do next? It's nice if you write that down and actually have a plan. But when I got into this bed, I realized there were no tree roots in there. The soil was really awesome underneath. The problem I had was my strawberry plants over several years, even though I cut back the runners, they had multiplied from the crown. And there were, 200 maybe strawberry plants in a 4x8 bed. So I'm adjusting what I'm doing, but I know this bed needs something. So, one thing that you is really great to do this time of year is adding compost. So I had planned to go ahead and add compost anyway. If you look at the wheelbarrow, there's two types of compost in here. The one on the right is the one that I made myself at home. I have a big compost pile. Like I said, I have a place to do that. And I do chip everything before I put it in. I try not to put much in the green bin unless it's weeds. It was nice and rich and wonderful, moist. On the left is some compost that I purchased with the recommendation of a neighbor who had a gorgeous, thriving garden. And I thought, I'm going to try that one. The problem was when I got that compost, I'm sure it was fine. It was very, 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 very dry. So it had been sitting on concrete for a long time. And I'm sure it lost some nutrients, but I was not sure how that would work. So I wanted to do a mixture of both. Both of those are going to add back nice, rich ingredients into the soil for me. So when I put this compost in, I once had a neighbor who said, I'm going to start a garden, but I've got to get my gardener out to with his rototiller. And I thought, oh my gosh, a rototiller. So most of the time we don't want to use a rototiller. We're practicing minimal soil disturbance. As you can see down in this illustration, I mean, it is a whole nother city underneath the top of the soil. And we want to keep that going because that's what puts life back into our soil. So if you don't dig all this up, it improves the water retention because it leaves the spaces in there. It supports beneficial soil organisms, and it reduces weed seed reintroduction because you're not digging it all up again, and you're keeping the carbon in the soil. So when I'm adding my compost, I'm thinking about that. When I pulled these plants out, I was taking the roots because, I'm a frugal gardener. And when I saw all of those strawberry plants that really just needed to be divided, I wanted to keep them. So I did carefully pull up the roots, put them in the shade so that I could use them later in another spot. And then I went through and I put the compost on the top. And because I hadn't done this for like 4 years, I'd side dressed with compost, adding it in on the side of the strawberries. But I didn't get, every place in there. I added probably 3 inches of compost. And that would be an awful lot. I raked it in with my fingers. As I was going through, I could tell this was a nice, wonderful soil. But I also raked it in really carefully with a rake. I'm not digging down. Then while it's available, now you notice at the back there, I've got strawberries that I still left in. I took all of those out, but I was doing a demonstration for this video. So I wanted some of those in there to show. I love the way that we've done the irrigation in these beds, and it's very flexible. So this, though, is the perfect time to go through and test it out, to clear out the lines, to adjust them. So this is what I came up with for what was going to go back in there next. So I straightened them all out. I turned it on. I tried them. I made sure I had to replace one that had a hole in it. And I, blew out the ends so that there wasn't any deposits in there. Really good time to do that. So then my nice compost is down underneath, and I water very slowly, because especially that compost that was very dry, what happens with that is it just, it almost repels the water. You have to get it nice and moist first, and then it'll do a really great job at retaining the water. So it takes going slowly, water a little bit, come back, water a little bit, come back. you don't want it pouring out the bottom because, nothing is being retained that way. Then I cover with a thick layer of mulch. So this time I used rice straw here. I like rice straw because it doesn't have the seeds, that other types of straw does. And a lot of times I collect leaves. I've got a lot of deciduous trees that are in good shape that aren't diseased. And if you have a blower, a lot of those blowers, you can reverse it so that it's like a vacuum and you can clean up your leaves. And it puts them through and chops them up sort of better than they were to start with. And that's really nice to go through and put on top. I do that a lot because I've got a lot of deciduous trees. Okay, but you want to cover the soil for sure, no matter what you're going to be putting in. So my mulch, the mulch provides erosion control. So imagine if I didn't, and then the rains came, and let's say we had a fabulous year with rains. I mean, it would just wash all the good compost that I've put mostly on the top away. It helps with splash protection so things don't just go right out. It suppresses the weeds and it really conserves the moisture underneath. So what you could do then is you could plant anything you wanted to in that bed, or you don't have to plant anything. It's okay if you don't want to plant a winter garden. In fact, it's sort of late to plant a winter garden now, unless you want to do greens and kale and that kind of stuff. But if you do the steps that I just outlined, boy, your soil is going to thank you. And we're going to go through and next year, when you start back again in the spring, if you're taking the winter off, you'll find that your soil is more productive. Now, let's say you want to do just a little bit more and you want to add something more back in. Kathy's going to talk to you about that. And Kathy is, she does library talks. You might have heard her before on cover crops. The woman gets crazy excited about cover crops, okay? And it really is pretty awesome. So here is a picture that a cover crop that I did at Harvest for the Hungry Garden. Okay, so Kathy's going to tell you about cover crops now.
Start with something talking about keeping your garden alive, which Toby was talking about. That part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we're feeding our garden. And the garden, as Toby said, we see the top, we see above the soil. That's what we're mainly looking at, but there is a whole life, a whole world underneath. And that few inches of soil in which we grow things is what sustains our life and all the life above the soil. So it's so important and so exciting, as Toby said. This is a little bit of information about what goes on underneath the soil. Little background here. Underneath the plant is, in its root system, is what's called the rhizosphere. That's basically the sphere around the roots. And in the roots, as they've been able to look at them microscopically, there's a very dynamic process that happens in interaction with the elements that are in the soil. The fungal elements, you've probably heard the term mycorrhizal, which are the positive fungi which interact with the roots symbiotically. And you can see in the slide, you see at the top where you see the fungal hypha bringing nutrients to the soil, they actually interpenetrate into the roots. And then they extend the root zone out beyond the roots so that the plant has an extended root zone, which is really part of the fungi. In response to that, as a sort of the payback, the plant is exuding almost 30% of the sugars that they produce. So they're feeding those other elements in the soil. So we used to just think you put the plant in and it absorbed the, the nitrogen and the phosphorus. It's more complicated. And in addition, you have certain kinds of bacteria which interact positively in the soil. This is a whole long discussion about the soil, but I thought that's a great slide and gives you a little bit of a picture. As Toby said, when we do an annual food garden, if you think about it, it's sort of an unnatural process in the world system. We're removing a lot of nutrients and materials from the garden and the soil on an ongoing basis, particularly if you're doing a garden in which you produce several different crops in a single bed. So it's incumbent upon us to return things to the soil. We're returning nutrients, carbon, minerals to continue to grow an annual garden. So we'll talk at the end of the slideshow about, yes, you can add some things directly. You can add chemicals to the soil, but there's a downside. People do it, and because you can grow things, but over a longer term, there's some negative impacts from that. And we're trying to create a living system in the soil. So as gardeners, we have choices on how we return things to the soil. And those choices are important to consider both for our health and the health of our environment. So just really quickly, I'm not going to spend a long time on the slide, but you can, as Toby said, you can have a winter garden, and it's a little late to plant most things. If you want to pop in some of those greens from some of the nurseries, you might get some results. But you have other choices, and Toby talked about some of them. You can mulch, and there are a number of substances you can use to mulch the soil to keep it protected and reduce the weeds. You can add compost. Important to look, as Toby said, what you're talking about when you talk about compost. In another presentation that I do, I looked at what different landscape supply in the area talk about as compost, and what they include in it can be very different. So generally, compost is decomposed plant materials and often animal manures. And then sometimes companies add a lot of stuff to that. So look at what's in your compost and decide what you want to add to your soil. I'm going to be talking to you about cover crops. And if you've been looking at the slide, it does a wonderful bunch of things, and we're going to be talking more about that. So I'm not going to stay on this slide. So basically, a cover crop is a non-food crop that is planted when a garden area might be otherwise fallow, with the intention of improving and enhancing the health of the soil. It can do that in a vast number of ways. And as Toby said, I got all excited about cover crops. I started web surfing, and I ended up on a website called the SARE, S-A-R-E. It's Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. It's a federal agency of the federal government, actually, Federal Department of Agriculture, which looks at sustainable agriculture, and they have researched cover crops in depth, as has, if you look at our UC Davis website, they also have some good materials on cover crops. So handy. Here you see the SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. So what do cover crops do? Well, first of all, you're looking at building organic material. Through the roots penetrating deep into the soil, they actually take the rainfall and help it infiltrate into the soil. So not only holding it in the top layer, but bringing it down deeper. You can outcompete some of those weeds. You can encourage pollinators and beneficial insects. You reduce the soil compaction. The roots make, as they decompose, they make little spaces in the soil, which continue to keep the soil aerated. And as you're adding the carbon, the material back into the soil, you're creating more spaces in the soil. We'll talk later about nitrogen and the role of legumes. And some of you have probably heard of fava beans in the garden, and that's probably our most common familiarity with cover crops. And it's a little bit of magic, so we'll talk about that. Economic returns, this was, as I said, for an agricultural website. And preventing soil erosion. Excellent research in the Midwest on when you have very, very heavy rains, comparing soils that have cover crops versus those that don't. And scavenging nitrogen means really the plants that don't draw nitrogen from the air like legumes, but actually draw it from the soil, hold it in their plant bodies, and then when you harvest the cover crop, they're returned. So basically, you have some choices. When you're looking at your winter cover crops, you want to clean out your diseased or unhealthy materials. So you want to make some choices. If you have something that really looks unhealthy, you might want to head that to the green bin. And the other materials you're hopefully composting. If you've cut them down to the base, as Toby said, we tend to prefer to emphasize the no-till gardening. And hopefully at some time we'll do a whole presentation on that. But it's basically cutting plants down to the level of the soil and leaving those roots in the soil. So you're going to spread your seed mix, and we'll talk about choices for seed mixes and why you might choose certain mixes. In this area, Western Farms, Harmony Supply, and a place called LaBallisters are excellent sources of bulk cover crop mixes. So you're going to rake that in lightly, and then you're going to cover with compost and or both light mulch. You're going to water until it rains if you're doing it in your beds, or if you've got that magic year where you can put in the seed right before it rains, that's great. And then the care throughout the winter, not much. You get to read your seed catalogs and let your cover crop grow throughout the winter. So this is a picture of a variety of different cover crops. You've got choices. This is barley, and it was at Bear Farms where we had a Master Gardener project. In the back, you see a mix of a barley and fava beans. And the grasses like barley provide a lot of bulk plant material when you harvest them. You also need to know that they decompose slightly more slowly than things like the legumes. This is another lovely choice for adding to your cover crop mixes. This is Phacelia tenicifolia. It's a cover crop that's used widely in vineyards and in orchards, and you can see why it might be used in orchards. It's a great pollinator plant. I swear the bees love this better than almost any other plant. It's just hard to cut it down when it's not fully flowering because it's so pretty. This is one that you might be familiar with. This is fava beans. Many cover crop mixes, particularly green manure mixes, as they're called, which are used in vegetable beds, contain legumes. Here you'll see this container garden when you look at the videos, and I just showed this to you because this was the video shows me planting these, and you can see these were taken about a week ago, and they're already producing a very nice, lovely, healthy cover crop. So basics. Late September through October is usually when I try to put my cover crops in. If I'm putting them in the beds, I can water them and get them started. And starting them during this time means that you're really giving yourself time to get a full crop. You'll be able to harvest it in the spring in a timely fashion and be able to let it decompose. So usually I have a mix of nitrogen fixing legumes and deeper rooted grasses. Having a mix of plants makes for a more diversity of benefits. You're getting both the bulk of the grasses and the deep rooted aspect of the grasses, so they're getting a deep infiltration into the soil. The grasses are helping to scavenge the nitrogen, and then the legumes are those magical plants which will fix nitrogen, and I'll show you that later. You also get a diversity of different kinds of fungal networks and positive bacterial networks. So little diversity. Why? Okay, we're trying to add nutrients, improve the soil structure, reduce the water runoff, suppress weeds, and increase our insect habitat. Harvesting your cover crop. You want to be harvesting when you have about 10 to 30% of flowering of your legumes. So those will be your kind of markers. You have choices. You can cut and compost. You can dig it into the soil. We're not heavily recommending those two, but those are options. So what we're recommending is a chop. Oops, this is chop and crop. Chop and drop is actually what I wanted. Chop and drop. And here we go. This is a few years ago. This is before I was doing mixes of grasses in with the legumes. These are fava beans in the garden, and pretty good crop. They're not quite ready for, you don't see them flowering, but when they're flowering, sorry, during this time, here's the magic. We talked about the bacteria and the symbiotic bacteria with certain plant roots. So legumes are one of our miracle plants, which actually take nitrogen out of the air. They draw it down into their roots, and around their roots, they have bacteria which will create these little nodules, which are nitrogen holding nodules. When these nodules, when the plant's starting to flower, they're at their prime, they will be pinker rather than totally white. And these are holding nitrogen. You've actually taken nitrogen out of the air and brought it into your soil. Lightning also can do this. It can bring nitrogen into your soil. And then there are a few other groups of plants, but this is why people are most familiar with using legumes in gardening, vegetable gardening. So here I've taken, this was actually a crop at Bear Farms, and actually used a machete. You can actually also just chop it up with some kinds of garden shears and chop the plants into fairly small pieces. And then this was back in my garden, you cover those legumes with a nice compost. And that, the reason I do that now, the compost on top, is that the compost isn't alive. It has a active live element, decomposing element in it, and it helps sort of jumpstart the decomposition of these plants. They'll do it otherwise. And within a few weeks, 4, 5, 6 weeks, the plants will dry out, will begin to decompose, and you have a wonderful, rich environment for planting your plants. One of the things I want to talk about is people are like, well, why not a chemical fertilizer? Well, chemical fertilizers are used because they work, right? You can get your plants to grow, but as someone said, it's a little like giving cocaine or something to your plants. You know, so do you want plants that are addicts? Not really. You want plants that are lively and interacting with the soil. Many of the chemical fertilizers we used were byproducts of the weapons industry, and they found a good use for some of the nitrates from that. It's greatly increased since the 1930s, and it increased the crop yield, but it had some bad effects, right? One of the things is that they work by providing the essential nutrients directly to the plants, and the plants kind of go, oh, well, then why should I feed the fungi and the bacteria, because I don't need them. So you get a plant environment, a soil that is depleted of life. It's really, the life force in that really is gone. And the symbiotic elements which work with the roots are gone. So generally, the major chemical fertilizers focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and there are many, many other elements, minerals that are part of what plants need and utilize. So downsides, as I said, they interrupt the exchange of plants and their partners in the soil. They decrease the access of the micronutrients. And then a really big one, which Toby has talked about, and I talked about a little bit, but is a whole nother really presentation, is they don't improve the soil structure. You begin to have, as you're not having things decomposing and life kind of ongoing in the soil, you lose the creation of what's called the sort of a soil sponge. If you pick up a healthy soil, it smells wonderful. It has that kind of soft, crumbly, lovely organic aspect. And when you're using chemical fertilizers, you reduce the process. You negatively impact the process, which creates that kind of soil. So by adding things like mulch, compost, cover crops to the soil, you're adding carbon, you're adding organic materials, which create a humus and a very complex life interaction in the soil. Plus, many fertilizers are obtained from non-renewable resources and transported at cost and environmental impact. So we want to do things that can add life to the soil. And again, just to reiterate, not to be too redundant, but you can consider mulch, compost, and cover crops. Just, if you're not growing a garden right now, add something in. If you have animal manure that you're adding to your compost, make sure it's aged, it's weed-free, and it's organic. And when you plant, and this is again another lecture, if you're going to use organic fertilizer, you can, when we do the no-till gardening, we're minimally tilling or disrupting the soil. And you can target a tiny bit of that organic fertilizer right around the specific plant root if you want. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move into the videos. And Toby, I'll stop sharing and you start sharing the videos.
Somebody asked, is it too late to plant a cover crop? So I'd like you to go ahead and do that.
Good question. We do have rain predicted, so that's great. If you plant your cover crop now, you want to consider planting it. You're not going to get as much product, basically. You're going to get the plants will maybe grow a little bit now, but they will really start growing in the spring. So you'll get some benefit from them, absolutely, through the winter. What you're going to need to consider is that they may not be at full flowering if you're thinking of planting an early spring bed. So if I was going to plant a cover crop right now, I would be planting it in areas where I was going to be planting later spring, later or summer plantings.
Kathy, I'm going to have you talk about how you can go to Harmony or LaBallisters or any one of those other spots that you had suggested, and how they will help you with choosing your cover crop.
Yeah, so if you go to, I'm most familiar with Harmony and LaBallisters, and basically if you go there and talk to them about your purpose for your cover crop. If we get to the videos, you'll see that sometimes you make choices not only planting in a vegetable bed, but maybe in some other areas. Maybe you have an area where that's under some trees, orchard area, and you want something that will, provide some pollination, and you also want something that will enrich the soil. Okay, this is a cover crop mix, also known as a green manure mix, and it's called an organic seed blend. It has a mix of Dundale peas, vetch, bell beans, also known as fava beans, oats, and barley. So it has a mix of essentially legumes, which fix nitrogen in the soil, and it has some grasses, which provide a deep-rooted mix and some additional organic matter when you harvest that. So I'm going to be planting this organic seed mix in this planter, and then I'll be covering it with some compost. Okay, I'm going to spread the seed mix here in this planter, and I'm going to give it a pretty good cover. That's it. And then I'm going to put the compost on top. And next, I would be watering the seed in. Okay, generally with garden beds, vegetable beds, I would plant my organic seed mix, the green manure, a little bit later so that I could try and catch right before the rains. Given that this is in a very contained area, I can plant it earlier and water it in and feel like I can keep it watered so I can get a kind of head start. So the nice thing about cover crops is once the rains start, basically you don't have to do anything. So throughout the winter, the cover crop will grow. And then in spring, when the plants in the cover crop have about 10 to 30% flowering, that's the time that you can cut them back. And essentially what you do once you have the cover crop is that you cut the plants down to the base. And there are various ways that you can handle cover crop. You can either harvest it and put it in your compost, but generally what I do is what's called a chop and drop. So I cut it at its base, leaving all those roots in the soil because particularly the legumes have drawn the nitrogen down from the atmosphere and deposited the nitrogen into the bacterial nodules that are around the roots. So you want to leave all that in the soil because what you're doing is feeding the soil. You cut it down to the base. You can leave the green material there. And then in spring, once I've cut it, I will cover it again with a compost and some straw. And essentially what you're doing is letting it compost in place at that point until you're ready to plant in it. You want to give it a good 4 minimum to 8 weeks to begin to decompose and really enrich the soil. Crop, you can consider using our California wildflowers. So the function of this is similar to the grasses in many ways in that they create some erosion protection. They create some increased penetration and moisture in the soil. But the primary reason that I use wildflowers is to provide an offering to the local insects and birds. And I have a Phacelia tannicifolia, which is a native plant. It's used often actually in orchards, and it attracts insects. Bees love this. They love it more than almost any plant that I know. And then I have a general wildflower mix. And basically what I would do is I would rake this and loosen it a little bit, the soil area here. And then I would be spreading the wildflower mix and covering it with what's called an arbor mix, which is a sort of a ground up decomposed forest materials. And I would try to time it so that I would catch right before the rains, because again, this is an area that's not irrigated and I'm wanting to create a cover and a beneficial area for local insects and birds.
when do you start vegetable planting? After you chop and drop your cover crop? That would be a nice thing to talk about.
Basically, you need to allow some time for the cover crop to decompose. Different kinds of cover crops will decompose more or less quickly. Things like the legumes, which are very soft bodied, will decompose pretty quickly. So within about 4 weeks or so, you can plant. If you're using grasses, you want to consider giving a little bit longer time, and you want to make sure you cut those grasses up in very small parts. In addition, if you're using primarily grasses, you're wanting to increase the carbon load in your soil, you're going to need to make sure you cut them right down at the base of the soil. And one of the things I've done with grasses sometimes is compost and then add a thick layer of mulch on the top, because the grasses can tend to sprout again in your beds. So usually it's about 4 to 8 weeks, which means what you need to do is think about what you want to plant in which bed. Plan ahead a little bit, which is not one of my great strengths, but it's highly recommended.
I don't know, Kathy. I think you do a great job at that. So we
And let it decompose.
yeah.
However, saying that, I've found that that even when the plant material is not fully decomposed, it makes a wonderful mulch, and I've simply planted my starts within that. Planting seeds is a little challenging if it hasn't fully decomposed, but if you have plant starts, usually just fine.
Great. Okay. I did want to add in, there was a question as far as the rats. So, I don't even want to say this, but I haven't had issues with rats, and I am in the country. I've had huge issues with voles and moles and gophers, but we can deal with the gophers. So I did find that when we planted a cover crop last year, it was under all of our fruit trees, that it seems like this borders another field. There's a fence there, which is mowed, and a field that's mowed most of the time. But, I don't think those voles know the difference between the field and my cover crop. So you do need to make sure you cut it down at the right, at the time where it's going to benefit the soil, right as things are starting to bloom. Like Kathy said, it's hard to do that because it looks so pretty. The other thing is you don't want, like I have pollinator plants that are right up to the edge of my bed. Well, I did find that those voles, the meadowmice, can climb up those pollinator plants and just jump right in. So to my beds, and they really do love that nice thick layer of straw. So you do need to, check it occasionally, but if you don't have a lot of other stuff up against it, that'll really help. So, and you do have to be watching, because pretty soon, especially once spring comes, then it can be an issue. Let's see, Kathy, there was another good question for you that I saw. Oh, about she asked, any more info on birds and insects cover crop? Any tips on enhancing the crop to take hold?
Birds and insects. Well, so cover crops, if you think about it, as I was saying, they're anything that really benefits the soil and the environment. And sometimes sunflowers can be planted as a cover crop. What we think of cover crops is usually a very specific thing, but essentially you're planting something that draws beneficial aspects into your garden. So any kind of California wildflowers, if you think about it, will be attracting local insects and supporting them. So that whole question about anything that will benefit the insects, oftentimes I have a lot of insect attracting plants around my garden, around the vegetable garden. Because if you're going to plant something to attract insects, you're usually going to want to let it fully flower and, in fact, sometimes go to seed. So, for example, I have a giant buckwheat in the garden area, and that's not a cover crop, but I want to let it fully flower. And second to the phacelia, it's probably the most attractive plant to local insects. And I also want to let it go to seed because I want to provide food for the birds. So if I don't give it to my chickens, which they also like, but so when you're really trying to attract insects primarily, then you're going to use that as not necessarily a cover crop that you're going to harvest in your vegetable bed. So again, we need to think about what the purpose is of the crop that we're growing to benefit the environment.
And I think also, like you were saying, that the native plants, the native California wildfire flowers, that those are the ones that our birds and insects need. Let's see. There was a question that says, does anybody build wire cages around tomato plants to keep the rats off? This year was a terrible year for rats in my city neighborhood garden. And, you know, I've heard that from lots of folks too. I know that some people have built structures in Sunset Magazine at one point. There was an article on Stephanie Bittner, who is a landscape designer, and she had done these gorgeous cages around her plants. My nephew made one of those cages, and it wasn't pretty, but boy, it did. That was the only way he could keep the rats off of his tomato plants, you know, in Mountain View. So I think it has to be something that they can't get through at all. He used sort of a flexible plastic mesh that went all over the top of it, but it is a problem. Go ahead, Kath.
If you haven't seen the movie The Biggest Little Farm,
Yeah.
that's a great movie to watch, and it kind of addresses some of the complexities of creating designing living systems, because there's a great part in there where they've planted cover crops in their orchard.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
And you see this, they're also in an environment where they happen to have some snails and slugs. And so they have a great crop of snails and slugs. So there's creating a balanced environment is not as easy as we would like. That's why, if fortunately, nature has a better track record than us. So when, you know, creating an environment where you don't have rodents, where you don't have snails, slugs, that's almost impossible. So you're looking at how you can mitigate the problems with those other creatures and kind of keep benefiting the areas that you want. There's not something we can certainly talk about, barriers to gophers, to voles, to moles, to rats, etc. Deer, and another topic.
Okay, there's a question. Thank you, Kathy. There was a question on my raised bed that said it. He said that he noticed that I had five drip lines in a 4x8 raised bed. His new ones didn't have that many. Are they going to have enough water? You know what? It really just depends. The thing I love about those, where you have the 5/8 inch pipe, and then you have the spaghetti lines going out. I like the lines that have emitters every 6 inches. For me, that works for most things that I'm doing. And I love it that you can go through and just pull it out of that 5x8 pipe and then, plug up the hole. So you can adjust. Berries need a lot of water. And however, they don't want their crown wet. They're a little fussy, but so in the middle of the summer, what I would do is I would add another line in sometimes. So I had two lines going down with the strawberries in the middle, sort of offset a little bit. So, sometimes I think I always put about 4 lines in a raised bed. But it's up to you how much water that you need, where you are. Kathy's yard probably needs less water than my yard. She's in Sebastopol and she's got some nice cover. And I am in Santa Rosa, you know, in the middle of a field, basically, with lots of exposure and wind and that type of thing.
There are questions about other kinds of legumes that you can use. That's fava beans. And really, if you go to any of the places that we suggested, Western Farms, LaBallesters, Harmony, they can have a discussion with you about where you want to use your legumes and what the purpose is. For example, clovers are great at fixing nitrogen, but they might not be something that you want to use in your bed. Usually the mixes that are sold as green manures, is what they're usually called, are specifically designed for vegetable beds. They usually include vetch, something called Dundee peas, and bell beans are the primary ones that I know that are used. You can, under an orchard area, you could do a whole area of clover if you felt like you weren't wanting to enhance the nitrogen in your soil. It really depends, again, what your intent is with your cover crop as to what you want to use.
And you know, I love those places that you mentioned, basically because, you know, when you have a certain amount of information, you think you know, and you go in and they will ask you first. If you're asking for help, they'll say, what is the intention of this? When are you going to plant it? Have you considered? And they'll give you some great information. That always helps me. I had gone in and I got a green manure mix and I added in crimson clover because, you know, I wanted to have some clover in there as well. And they did it and mixed it all up in the bag for me, so I didn't have two separate bags. And, you know, depending on what you get, it's not terribly expensive either. And it's low once you get it in, depending on how big your area is. It's, you know, it takes care of itself, just like she said. So
depending how deeply you want to investigate the subject, as I said, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education site has some good material on kind of the benefits and the downsides of different kinds of cover crops, as does the UC A&R website, which is on our Master Gardener information page. And that talks in more specifics about if you're going to grow certain kinds of crops in the bed, you might not want to put in a cover crop that is too similar, because you might not, it's sort of like rotating your crops. You don't put maybe lettuce in the same place every year. Maybe you do, but or tomatoes in the same place every year. If you can, it's great to rotate it. And really what you're trying to do with a cover crop is have an extra rotation of a crop. And you might not want to plant something that attracts the same kinds of problematic insects that the crop that you're going to follow with might be vulnerable to. So you want to, but again, for most of our purpose, go get yourself a nice green manure mix, add it to your bed, cover it with some compost, and just enjoy it and let it grow during the winter.
Kathy, did you answer the question about is it too late to plant a cover crop?
I said, ideally, yes. Yes, it's a little late, but why not? Because what you're going to do is you're going to be growing your own organic material. You're really going to be growing the material that you would be getting from compost. So go ahead and plant some. The rains are coming, hooray. And you'll get some plant material. You may not be able to get it to the full maturity where it's really fixed as much nitrogen in the soil as would be ideal. But you can also make choices about planting later crops in the beds that you're planting the cover crops. So, you know, you're going to get some benefit from it, and the soil will get benefit. asked about inoculating. Most of the soil you'll buy from the seed companies is pre-inoculated with the excuse me, the appropriate bacteria. So you don't usually have to add anything.
And answers. And here is our resource page. And I have to say, I want you to think about making up a list of, holiday gifts that you really would like to have, or if you have a gardener on your list. There's lots of wonderful things that people always need garden gloves, of course, but I would suggest some books. I put 3 of my favorite books on soil, and they're on our information page. It's really great, positive reading that you can do over the winter when you're sitting inside and you're tired of looking at your seed catalogs. Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown, Growing a Revolution by David Montgomery, and The Soil Will Save Us by Kristen Olson. All 3 of those, I think, any gardener would love to read. And it really drives home that fact that we really need to do something about our soil and help it along. And as home gardeners, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, Toby, on that note, I have to say that when I discovered the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education site and started listening to YouTube videos of these Midwestern farmers like Gabe Brown, working on regenerative agriculture and really creating remarkable changes in their soil health, and started getting information about what could be done, which led me into the whole regenerative agriculture area, I felt hopeful. And
Yeah.
I think most of us could use that because we really have made such a excuse me, mess of our environment as people. And there are people researching and doing things to really mitigate the negative impacts that we've had. And some of this material will provide you some hope and inspiration during the winter months. So those 3 books that Toby recommended are excellent. And then Gabe Brown is one of my heroes, my soil heroes.
It is. It's very hopeful, and I think we need hopeful things right now when we hear so much negative about everything, but the environment as well. And I think that we can all do our part, but it's great to know there's guys out there and women, I'm sure, like Gabe Brown, that are doing big things for our world.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So any master gardeners think of anything we've left off? You can unmute and chime right in. I would, if you would like to go through and add anything in that you would like to hear on our next Veggie Happenings, the next one won't be until January. So we're taking December off, and that's a good time to start looking through those catalogs and getting things ordered, because probably it'll be a busy year again next year. We really appreciate.
I'm sorry, a quick question, please, Ms. Brown. How much compost do you put in raised bed? How many inches, like 1, 2, 3?
Well, it just depends. And I think you'd need at least an inch and a half or so. What do you say, Kath? About the?
Well,
always add more.
I live in Sebastopol, so I have sandy soil, and I almost cannot add enough organic material. So it does partly depend on the sort of basic makeup of your soil, but again, we're taking lots of stuff out. We're drawing a lot of stuff from the soil, and maybe you can add too much. And I've heard that.
This is Kitty. You should never be growing in 100% compost.
Okay.
You always need to have at least 50% soil. And soil and compost are not the same.
No, they're not.
Great. That's great. Anything else? Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you in January.
Toby, list the name of the books you mentioned, please.
Okay, and those are on our resource page. One is Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. If you haven't read Gabe Brown's book, read it. And they're all available at the library. I would have brought them, but I checked them all out from the library. And so I couldn't get them again. Growing a Revolution by David Montgomery. And The Soil Will Save Us by Kristen Olson. Wonderful books. Your gardener will love those for the holidays. All right. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you in January.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.